My mother died on a Tuesday, the kind of day that shouldn't be allowed to hold that much weight. Tuesdays are supposed to be unremarkable leftover coffee, half-finished to-do lists, the middle child of the week that nobody notices. But that Tuesday, I got a call from my aunt telling me my mother had collapsed in her kitchen, and by the time I landed in Phoenix, she was already gone. I'm a forensic accountant. I spend my days finding the numbers people try to hide, the transactions that don't add up, the patterns that look innocent until you pull the thread. I'm good at it because I grew up in a house where things were always slightly off and nobody ever said so out loud. That kind of childhood either breaks you or sharpens you. It sharpened me. My mother was 61. She walked 3 miles every morning, kept her sodium low, her checkups regular, and her medicine cabinet organized by expiration date. Her doctor called it cardiac arrest. A natural event, he said, in a tone that meant he had 4 more patients waiting, and this conversation was already over. Natural. I'd been hearing that word applied to my mother's life for 30 years, and it never fit right. I wore black slacks and a gray blouse to the funeral because I couldn't find my way to color that morning. My younger brother, Derek, stood at the front of the room in a suit that cost more than my monthly rent, his wife, Sandra, beside him with her hand resting on his forearm like she was posing for a photograph. They looked the part. They always looked the part. I hadn't spoken to Derek in 4 months. Not since the argument about the property, the house my grandparents left my mother, the one Derek had been pushing her to sell for the better part of 2 years. My mother kept saying she wasn't ready. Derek kept saying she was being sentimental. I kept saying it was her house and her decision and Derek needed to back off. That was the last real conversation the 3 of us had together. I stood near the back during the service, close enough to hear the pastor but far enough that I didn't have to make eye contact with anyone who might want to tell me how sorry they were. I had nothing left for that today. I needed what was left of myself to stay upright. After the service, when people were filing out and the room smelled like lilies and someone's too strong perfume, a woman I didn't recognize walked straight toward me. She was in her mid-50s, conservative blazer, reading glasses pushed up on her head, carrying a leather portfolio like she'd come from a meeting rather than a funeral. She stopped in front of me and said, quietly, "You're Claire." "Yes," I said. "My name is Judith Warren. I'm your mother's attorney." She paused, glancing briefly at Derek and Sandra across the room. "I need you to come to my office. Today, if possible. There's something your mother left that I think you need to see before anyone else does." I looked at her. "What kind of something?" She dropped her voice even lower. "Documents. And a recording she made 3 weeks ago." She met my eyes steadily. "She was very specific about who should receive them. And she was very specific that your brother should not be present when you do." I felt the room tilt slightly, the way it does when information arrives too large for the moment you're standing in. "She was afraid," Judith said simply. Then she handed me a card, turned, and walked out through the side door before Derek could see us talking. I put the card in my pocket. I didn't tell anyone where I was going. I kissed my aunt's cheek, said I needed air, and walked to my car with the kind of deliberate steadiness that comes from years of keeping your face neutral while your insides run in the opposite direction. Judith's office was 15 minutes from the funeral home. Small, clean, organized the way people are organized when they take their work seriously rather than just wanting it to look that way. She was already at her desk when the receptionist brought me back. The portfolio was open. There was a manila envelope on the desk with my name on it in my mother's handwriting. Seeing her handwriting was the closest I came to losing my composure all day. Judith didn't make me wait. She slid a printed document across, first a copy of a revised estate filing dated 8 weeks before my mother died. "Your mother came to me in February," Judith said. She'd noticed discrepancies in her accounts, small amounts at first, then larger ones. I picked up the document, account transfers, consistent dates, early morning before 7 a.m., which my mother never was. She didn't even make coffee before 8. She thought someone had access to her login credentials, Judith continued. She'd started keeping 2 sets of records, one online, one handwritten, in a notebook she kept at the back of her linen closet. "Did she say who she suspected?" I asked, though the shape of the answer was already forming. Judith folded her hands on the desk. She didn't say it directly. She said she wasn't certain. "But she asked me specifically to make sure this information reached you and only you." She nodded toward the manila envelope. "She left that 3 weeks ago. She came in alone." She was calm, but she wanted everything documented properly. I opened the envelope carefully. Inside was a folded letter and a USB drive. The letter was 2 pages, her handwriting, the neat cursive she'd used my whole life. I'll reconstruct it from memory because I've read it enough times that it lives in me now. She wrote that she'd started noticing things around 6 months before she died. Small things first, a drawer she kept closed was slightly open, a file on her computer moved to a different folder, a password reset email she hadn't requested. She assumed she was being forgetful. Then the bank statements came. She'd set up a secondary savings account years ago, one she used for what she called her quiet fund money she set aside for things she wanted to do on her own terms. A trip, a donation, a gift she didn't want to negotiate with anyone about. The balance had been decreasing for 4 months in amounts just under $500, always on weekday mornings, always from an ATM near the north side of town. My mother lived in the south part of Phoenix. She had no reason to be on the north side before 7 in the morning. Derek and Sandra lived 6 blocks from that ATM. The letter got harder to read after that. She wrote that she'd started feeling unwell in January, fatigue that didn't respond to rest. A persistent nausea she kept attributing to stress. Her hands would go cold and stay cold. Her doctor ran blood work and told her some levels were slightly off but nothing alarming, and she should follow up in 2 months. She said she tried to follow up in March and her online portal showed no outstanding concerns. But she could have sworn the January results had flagged something she hadn't understood. Then she wrote one sentence that I had to set down and breathe through before I could continue. I don't want to believe what I'm starting to think, but I've watched Derek long enough to know what it looks like when he wants something badly enough to stop waiting for it. I put the letter down. I picked up the USB drive and looked at Judith. She told me what's on it, Judith said. She recorded herself going through her own financial records, narrating what she found, what the dates were, what the amounts were, and where the withdrawals were located. She paused. She also recorded one other thing, a conversation. With Derek? With Sandra. About 3 weeks before your mother died. Your mother didn't tell Sandra she was recording. Judith's voice stayed even. Sandra said some things your mother found significant enough to preserve. I held the USB drive in my palm for a long moment. She was building a case. She was protecting you, Judith said. She told me she wasn't sure she'd live long enough to do it herself. I drove to my hotel instead of my aunt's house. I needed 4 walls and silence. I opened my laptop, plugged in the drive, and sat with my back straight and my hands flat on the table while the files loaded, the way I sit when I'm about to go through financial records that are going to tell me something a client is going to hate hearing. The first file was the narrated recording. My mother's voice came through the speakers and I closed my eyes for just a moment before I made myself open them and look at the numbers she was describing. She was meticulous. She had every transaction, annotated date, amount, location, cross-referenced against her own calendar. She pointed out which days she'd been home all day, which days she'd been with my aunt, which days she'd been in the hospital for tests. On every single one of those days, a withdrawal had been made in her name from an ATM she'd never visited. 9 withdrawals over 15 weeks, just under $500 each. Just below the threshold that triggers automatic bank alerts. That's not carelessness. That's knowledge of how monitoring systems work. That's someone who'd thought about it. The second file was the conversation recording. Sandra's voice was recognizable immediately, that particular cadence she had, slightly too smooth, the way people sound when they've spent years making difficult things sound reasonable. My mother asked, in the recording, whether Sandra and Derek were having any financial trouble. Her voice was casual, the way my mother could make almost anything sound like small talk. Sandra said they were fine, then immediately said that actually, things had been a little tight with the renovation, and it would really help if my mother would just make a decision about the property. She said the market wasn't going to stay favorable. She said Derek was stressed about it. She said she didn't understand why my mother was holding on to a house she couldn't even drive to anymore. Then my mother said, gently, I just want to make sure everything is in order before I do anything. I've been getting my paperwork together. And Sandra said, and this is the part that stopped my breath. Well, you don't want to wait too long on that. The way your health has been going, you really can't afford to leave things undecided. She said it like concern, warm, measured, almost kind. But the phrasing, the way your health has been going, from a woman who had no medical knowledge, no conversation with my mother's doctors, no context for that statement other than whatever she and Derek had discussed privately, it landed in the recording like something cold. My mother said, you're right, I won't wait too long. She knew exactly what she was doing. She was letting Sandra confirm, on record, that she was aware of a health decline that hadn't been made public yet. I sat with both hands around a glass of water for a long time before I did anything else. I'm trained to look for fraud. I'm trained to build cases from patterns. But there's a difference between following a financial trail in a corporate audit and sitting in a hotel room 2 days after your mother's funeral, listening to her voice tell you she was afraid of her own son. The difference is that the corporate audit doesn't make your chest feel like something has been removed from it. I called Judith. It was past 7, but she answered. I need to know, I said, whether she had any formal testing done for toxicology. Judith was quiet for a moment. She didn't, while she was alive, but she asked me, in our last meeting, whether there was a way to preserve that option. Meaning she asked me to note in her file that she wanted a full toxicology screening included in any post-mortem examination. I submitted that request to the medical examiner's office the day after she passed. Another pause. They haven't completed it yet. Good, I said. Don't let them close without it. I didn't sleep that night in any real way. I lay on top of the covers going through the financial records Judith had given me copies of, cross-referencing against the timeline in my mother's narration, building the kind of spreadsheet I usually build for clients and never expected to build for my own family. By morning I had a clear picture. The withdrawals had started 1 month after Derek and my mother had their first serious conversation about selling the property, the one she told me about in December, the one that had ended with Derek raising his voice and my mother going quiet in the way she did when she'd made a decision she wasn't going to announce. The account accessed wasn't the main account, it was the secondary one, the quiet fund. Derek would have needed to know it existed to target it. My mother had never mentioned that account to me. She mentioned it to Derek once, years ago, during a conversation about her retirement planning. He would have filed it. I went to the medical examiner's office that morning before I called anyone. The examiner, Dr. Patricia Howell, was direct and unhurried in the way that people are when they deal with grief every day, and have learned that the most respectful thing they can offer is clarity. She confirmed that my mother's preliminary cause of death was cardiac arrest. She confirmed that the full toxicology panel requested by Judith was still pending. I gave her the USB drive, a copy of the financial records, and my mother's letter. I told her what I did for work. I told her what I'd found. She didn't dismiss me. She read the letter while I sat across from her, and when she set it down, she said, "Certain compounds can destabilize cardiac function in ways that can look like natural arrhythmia in a standard autopsy if we're not specifically testing for them." "Were you testing for them?" I asked. "The standard panel wouldn't include them," she said, "but the expanded panel I've been running will." She looked at me steadily. "That's why it takes longer." She gave me the name of a detective at the Phoenix PD who she said handled cases that started in her office. His name was Ray Cordero. She said he was thorough, and she'd already flagged my mother's case to him yesterday. Detective Cordero worked out of a building that smelled like burnt coffee and carpet cleaner. He was mid-40s, unhurried, with the particular kind of patience that meant he'd seen enough that almost nothing shocked him anymore, but everything still mattered. I laid out everything on his desk: financial records, timeline, the USB drive, Judith's documentation, my mother's letter. He went through each item without rushing, making notes in a small notebook with a pen that was almost out of ink. He switched pens halfway through without looking up. When he finished, he said, "Walk me through the Sandra recording." I described it. He wrote, "When I got to the line about the way your health has been going," he underlined something. "Did your mother have any contact with a personal physician other than her primary?" he asked. "Not that I know of." "And Sandra, did your mother ever describe their relationship as close?" "She described it as managed," I said. My mother was precise about words. If she said managed, she meant it. He nodded slowly. "You're forensic accounting?" "Yes. So you understand the difference between a pattern that looks suspicious and one you can actually prove." "That's my job," I said. "I find the ones you can prove." He let that sit for a moment. Then he said, "I'm going to request everything through formal channels: bank records, access logs, purchase history. If someone was sourcing anything pharmaceutical or supplement-based, there'll be a trail." He paused. "There's always a trail when someone thinks they're being careful but not careful enough." He handed me a card and told me not to reach out to Derek or Sandra until he'd had a chance to take a first pass at the records. He said it plainly, not like a command but like something obvious, the way you tell someone not to touch something until you understand what it is. I left his office and sat in my car in the parking structure for a few minutes with my hands in my lap. Not paralyzed, I don't do paralyzed, just letting myself feel the specific weight of what I now knew was happening and what was still ahead. My phone had 4 messages from Derek, all variations of the same theme. Where was I? We needed to talk. There was estate paperwork. Could we meet tonight? This couldn't wait. Estate paperwork. My mother hadn't been gone 72 hours. I texted back. Tomorrow. Give me the day. He replied within 90 seconds. It's time. Sensitive. The property listing window closes soon. I set the phone face down and drove back to my hotel. Cordero called that evening. His voice had shifted slightly, not alarmed but more precise, the way a person gets when the thing they suspected has started to confirm itself. The toxicology came back preliminary, he said. Elevated thallium levels, not enough to call it definitively the cause of death, yet the full confirmation takes more time, but enough that Dr. Howell is reclassifying the case. I knew what thallium was. It's a heavy metal, odorless, tasteless, historically called the poisoner's poison because for a long time it was almost impossible to detect. Hair loss, fatigue, nausea, cardiac effects in higher doses. It doesn't announce itself. It mimics. My mother's hands had gone cold and stayed cold. We're pulling purchase records now, Cordero said. Thallium compounds are regulated but accessible in certain industrial and agricultural products. If someone bought anything in the right category in the last 12 months, we'll find it. He told me they were also pulling IP address logs from my mother's bank portal and her medical records login. If anyone had accessed her accounts remotely, there would be a record. What do I do until then? I asked. Meet your brother tomorrow, he said. Don't tell him anything you know, let him talk. People who are covering something up talk in a specific way, they fill the silence with things they think sound reassuring. Listen to what he volunteers without you asking. I knew the technique. I'd used versions of it in fraud interviews for years. The difference between asking someone a question and letting them answer the question they're afraid you're going to ask. Derek wanted to meet at a restaurant, somewhere public and nice, the kind of place where emotional conversations are tamped down by ambient noise and good table manners. I suggested coffee instead, a place near my hotel, small, no reservations, easy to leave. He arrived with Sandra. I'd expected that. They looked composed. Derek had that careful expression he wore when he was managing a situation slightly soft at the edges, pitched just below warmth. Sandra ordered tea and held the cup with both hands like she was cold, which I noted because the restaurant was not cold. Derek started with condolences for himself, which he was always skilled at framing his own feelings as the first order of business. He said he was devastated. He said he'd been going through it. He said our mother deserved better than what her health had been doing to her these last months. There was that phrase again, what her health had been doing. I didn't know she'd been declining, I said evenly. She didn't tell me. Derek shifted. She didn't want to worry you. You know how she was. I do, I said. She was precise about what she told people and why. Sandra wrapped both hands more firmly around her cup. About the property, Derek said, transitioning in the way people do when they want to make a pivot look natural. I know the timing isn't ideal, but honestly, Claire, if we move quickly, we can list before the summer market softens. It's what she would have wanted. She knew the house was just sitting there. She told me in November that she wasn't ready to sell, I said. People change their minds, he said. Toward the end, she understood it was the practical thing. Toward the end, as if her death were a chapter they'd been reading ahead in. What end, specifically? I asked. A small pause. The last few months, when things got harder. Which things? His expression recalibrated. I watched it happen, the slight tightening around the eyes, the decision made in real time about which version of careful to use next. Her health, Claire. We were around more than you were. We saw how she was. Tell me what you saw, I said. Sandra spoke instead. She was tired. She had trouble with her energy. We were doing most of her grocery shopping toward the end. Most of her grocery shopping. What were you bringing her? I asked. The question was quiet, genuinely curious in tone, the kind of question that sounds like nothing until it lands. Sandra set down her cup. Normal things, what she asked for. Did she ask for supplements? She mentioned to me she'd been taking some new vitamins. Derek's jaw moved. I don't know what she was taking. We just helped when she needed it. That was kind of you, I said. Neither of them answered. I looked at Derek directly. She left documentation with her attorney. Did you know that? The shift was immediate. Not dramatic, nothing about Derek was dramatic in the obvious way, but the quality of his stillness changed. Like a machine cycling from one mode to another. What kind of documentation? He asked. She was thorough, I said. You know how she was about paperwork. Sandra looked at Derek. He looked at the table. We should probably get the estate process started, he said. The sooner everything is handled, the better. I agree, I said. I'll be handling everything through Judith Warren. Derek looked up. You already spoke with her? She came to the funeral, I said. She had something for me. He was quiet for 4 seconds. I counted. Then he said, we should all be looped in on that. She was our mother, too. She designated me as executor, I said simply. Sandra's lips pressed together. Derek's hand moved on the table, a small adjustment that told me his thoughts were moving faster than his expression. She never mentioned that, he said. A lot of things, apparently, she didn't mention to everyone. We stayed for another 10 minutes out of form. They ordered nothing else. They volunteered nothing else. When we stood to leave, Derek gave me a hug that lasted a beat too long, the kind that's meant to feel reassuring but instead feels like a check to see if anything has changed in you. Nothing had changed. Everything had changed. Detective Cordero called 2 hours later. The IP records came back, he said. Your mother's bank portal was accessed 6 times from outside her home network. 5 of those accesses originated from the same residential IP address. He let a short pause sit. Registered to Derek and Sandra Mercer. And the medical portal? 3 accesses in January and February, from the same address. 2 pages of blood work results were downloaded and removed from her viewable records. Another pause. She'd flagged abnormal potassium and neurological indicators. The kind of things that would have prompted follow-up testing if she'd seen them. She never saw them, I said. It wasn't a question. She never saw them, he confirmed. We also tracked down a purchase. Online supplier, agricultural grade, thallium sulfate compound, ordered 9 months ago. Paid by prepaid card, shipped to a pickup location in North Phoenix. How close to their address? 4 blocks. I sat down on the edge of the hotel bed. I wasn't shaking. I was the opposite of shaking. I was the kind of still that comes when something you feared is confirmed and the fear converts into something with edges. We're moving to a warrant, Cordero said. Their home, their devices, any storage they have access to. It'll take 48 hours. What do I do? Same as before, he said. Don't signal anything. If they reach out, respond normally. If they push for access to estate documents or the property, stall. Tell them you're waiting on the attorney. He added carefully, You've done well, Claire. The case your mother built, combined with what you've brought us, this is the kind of file that moves. I thanked him and stayed sitting on the edge of the bed for a while. My mother knew. She knew and she couldn't prove it yet, and she was trying to build a trail before something happened. She was 61 years old and she was quietly, carefully, gathering evidence against her own son because she knew that if she confronted him directly, she would lose the advantage and maybe more than that. She chose the version of herself that was an accountant before she was a grieving mother. She chose precision over anger. She left the trail to me because she knew I'd follow it the same way. That night, Derek texted twice. The first message asked if I'd thought any more about the property. The second, arriving 20 minutes later, said he'd spoken to a real estate attorney of his own who had some questions about the estate filing and could we meet again this week. His own real estate attorney. 48 hours after the funeral. I replied, I'm following everything through Judith. I'll let you know when there's news. He didn't respond. The warrant executed on a Thursday morning. I wasn't there for it, which Cordero said was appropriate. This wasn't a scene for family members, it was a scene for investigators. I learned what happened in pieces through calls from Cordero over the next several hours. They found the prepaid card receipts in a desk drawer. They found browser history showing research into thallium compounds, cardiac drug interactions, and estate law in Arizona, all conducted from Derek's home desktop beginning 11 months before my mother died. They found a notebook, ironically, a notebook, the same method my mother had used in which Sandra had written what appeared to be dosage timing notes alongside a schedule of visits to my mother's house. Sandra's notebook was the piece that broke Derek's composure at the station, according to what Cordero told me later. He'd managed to stay measured through the first round of questioning, that careful, managed affect I'd watched my whole life. But when the investigator laid the notebook on the table, Derek looked at it, and something in his face resolved into a kind of exhausted recognition. Like a man who'd been holding a story together for a long time and simply ran out of the strength to keep holding it. He asked for an attorney. So did Sandra, separately. Neither said anything further that day. Cordero called me that evening. I was sitting in Judith's office with the door closed and a cup of tea I'd forgotten to drink. We have enough, he said. They'll be formally charged tomorrow. First-degree murder for Derek. Conspiracy and administration of a toxic substance for Sandra. I said, she was 61. She walked every morning. I know, Cordero said, and he said it like someone who understood what that sentence actually contained. The trial was 4 months later. I drove myself to the courthouse both days of testimony, parked in the same spot each time, walked in through the same door. I don't know why the consistency mattered to me. It just did. The prosecution presented the financial trail first. I sat in the gallery and watched the jury look at the transaction records, the timing, the location, the pattern, and I watched their faces do the math. Jurors who work with numbers understand numbers immediately. Several of them leaned forward. The toxicology expert was methodical and clear. She explained what thallium does to a body over time. She translated the clinical language into plain English. She said, more than once, that the levels found in my mother's system were not consistent with accidental exposure and were consistent with repeated small doses over an extended period. The Sandra recording played in a courtroom that went very quiet. The way your health has been going, you really can't afford to leave things undecided. A juror in the second row closed her eyes briefly. A reporter in the back typed something and then stopped. When I testified, I spoke clearly and without ornamentation, the way I do in professional depositions. I described the letter, the USB drive, the financial patterns I identified, the conversation with Judith, the meeting at the coffee shop, every word Derek and Sandra had said that they had not been asked to say. The defense tried to characterize my mother's recordings as the anxious documentation of a woman whose health was affecting her cognition. The prosecution produced Judith, who testified to my mother's clarity, her precision, the careful intent behind every document she filed. The defense tried to attribute the thallium exposure to an industrial product my mother might have used in her yard. The prosecution produced the purchase record, the pickup location, the browser history, and Sandra's notebook. Derek's attorney called a character witness who said Derek was a devoted family member who had spent more time with his mother than anyone in her final year. The prosecutor spent 9 minutes on cross-examination, noting that the nature and timing of that devotion aligned precisely with the financial access and physical exposure that formed the basis of the charges. Closing arguments ended on a Wednesday afternoon. The jury deliberated through Thursday and came back Friday morning. When the foreman stood and read the verdict, I had my hands in my lap and my back straight. Guilty, on all counts, for Derek. Guilty. Conspiracy and administration of a toxic substance for Sandra. Sandra pressed her hand to her mouth. Derek stared at the defense table with the expression of a man encountering, for the first time, a version of reality that had no exit he could manage his way out of. My mother's attorney, sitting beside me, exhaled quietly. I didn't cry. I didn't feel triumph, which I think some people expected and which I'd braced myself to resist. What I felt was quieter and more final than that. It was the particular sensation of a thing being completed, not resolved, not healed, but finished in the way that facts become permanent. Sentencing came 6 weeks later. Derek received 32 years. Sandra, 14. I stood on the courthouse steps afterward in October sunlight, my jacket folded over my arm, Judith beside me. The city moved around us with complete indifference to what had just happened inside that building, which was right. The world didn't stop. That was always the deal. She would have found a way to be calm about this, Judith said. She was calm the whole time, I said. That was how she fought. My mother left me the house. Not because she'd given up on it, I understood now, but because she wanted it to go somewhere safe. The quiet fund account, what was left of it after the withdrawal, she left to a women's shelter she'd donated to for 20 years, a choice she'd made before any of this began. She had the whole shape of herself right until the end. She just needed someone to carry what she'd built. I went back to her house the weekend after sentencing and sat in her kitchen with a cup of coffee, and the morning light coming through the window she'd always said faced the right direction. I didn't bring my laptop. I didn't bring any files. I sat and drank the coffee and let the room be what it was. She left a trail. Not out of fear, not out of rage, but out of the same precision and care she'd brought to everything else. She made sure the truth had somewhere to go and someone who would follow it without flinching. I followed it. That was the only thing I had left to give her, and I gave it.